Hey, welcome back to the SA Sports Show. Well, now, time to talk a little bit, a touchy subject. It's not really a touchy subject, but a subject that's close to many hearts in the sporting world, especially today. And we're talking about concussions and head trauma and all those sorts of things that we never really worried about too much, say 4 or 5 years ago. Wasn't really worried about all that much. But joining me to talk a little bit about that, one of Adelaide's top neuro, I should say, physiotherapist, Victoria Veitch.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's very nice to chat with you. Explain your role a little bit too. I said neuro physiotherapist.
Yeah.
That's a new one to me.
Yeah.
Physiotherapists I know.
Yeah.
Neurosurgeons I know.
Yeah.
Explain your role a little bit to me.
Well, those like myself and at my clinic, we're neuro and vestibular physiotherapists, and most people don't actually know that that exists. We're specialists in anything under the neurological field.
Yeah.
So concussion being just one aspect of what we do, acquired brain injury, stroke, Parkinson's, MS, nerve dysfunctions, anything that involves the grey matter we do. But vestibular dysfunction is a really important part of what we do as well, and that's specifically inner ear dysfunction. So dizziness, vertigo, and imbalance related to injury to the vestibular nerve.
Yeah, I said in the opening there about the concussions, how really we were a bit flippant with concussion a few years ago. A player would play a game of football, and in the second quarter he'd get KO'd, and he'd be back playing before half time. They'd take him off, bit of wet towel, and away you go again. And you're no, mate, you're okay. Yeah. And it was a tough thing, I'm okay. I can go out there and play. Yeah. That doesn't happen anymore.
No.
Explain what's happening now.
Well, obviously there's a lot more anxiety regarding the subject. Several years ago, of course, there was the discovery of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Yeah. Now, that pushed a lot of people's anxiety buttons regarding head trauma. Concussion is not CTE itself. Concussion is a transient but low-level brain injury. Yeah. We just understand it better, and we know the importance of somebody actually recovering from a concussion before returning to a contact capacity.
Sure, yeah, okay. So when you talk about concussion, but we talk about concussion, we say, well, he's just had a knock and he'll be okay, he's a bit, a bit dizzy or whatever. Yeah. It's more than that. It's a lot more than that.
It's a lot more than that. So the pathology behind a concussion, it's actually quite interesting. When you get hit in the head, all of your grey matter gets stretched. Yeah. Now, what happens is the cells in your brain have little channels which control the flow of ions across the membranes. Okay. Yeah. Now, when your brain gets hit and stretched, those channels malfunction. Yeah, okay. Potassium floods out of the cells, calcium floods into the cells, and all of a sudden that means you've got uncontrolled neurotransmitter activating the brain. Okay. So basically your brain's on fire. It's just totally overloaded, totally over-functioning. Okay. Now, that's only one half of the story. Of course, the brain's going to do something to bring that back under control. Yeah. So what it has to do is it has to get those channel regulators back under control. Yeah. It's like the referee standing on a football field and realizing that all of your players are standing at the wrong end. Yeah. You've got to swap the whole team. So what those channel regulators have to do is they have to get the calcium out of the cell and the potassium back into it. Okay. And that's exhausting. Yeah. So what your brain then does is it feeds off the reserves of glucose in your brain. Yeah. So now you're exhausted as well. Yeah. You're totally overstimulated. You're totally, on that really high wire level. Yeah. And now you've got no energy in your brain either. Wow. And that's why confusion, memory problems, dizziness, fatigue, I can't think, I've got a foggy head. Yeah. And before, we used to just make sure that somebody was physically functioning and send them back on the field.
Send them back on, out you go, yeah. And you wonder why he runs around like a chook with his head chopped off.
Exactly.
That's right, but it's all bravery, it was all bravado back then, wasn't it?
It was.
Now, there's a handbook out at the present time for, not the learner, but
Yeah.
But for sporting organisations that need to control it, for those contact sports, there is a handbook out now that has been out since about
2016 was released between the Australian Institute of Sport and the Australian Medical Association.
Yeah.
That was really in response to some of this publicity coming in from overseas regarding head trauma and concussion, and people having high levels of anxiety about it, but not really having a management tool.
Okay.
So there is a really excellent user guidebook in terms of how sporting clubs should be managing suspected concussion.
Okay.
The guidelines are really easy to follow. They're accessible online, and they actually include a pocket concussion recognition tool.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So the lay person can jump online and understand that, okay, we'll say my child is exhibiting these symptoms, they're to be pulled off the field and not returned to the field unless these steps are taken.
Yeah.
So it makes it really simple.
Yeah. Well, I've noticed we have a player at the moment, one of our very good players at Port Adelaide, Brad Ebert's been out now for a few weeks with concussion, whereas back in the day it would be, he'll play next week, that's no problem.
That's right.
But the symptoms you just talked about, he obviously displayed at the club and whatever, so they sent him to Melbourne for scans and all this sort of thing.
Yep.
What does a scan do to, if he goes to have scans, which he said he was going to have in Melbourne, run me through that.
Okay.
What happens with that?
So in terms of those biochemistry changes that I was describing, there is no biomarker examination for that.
Yeah.
What they're looking for is there conclusive evidence of a brain bleed or swelling or something that they can actually visualize to explain the severity or the prolonged nature of those symptoms. Apart from scans, you might need to consider, depending on what type of symptoms, if a patient is demonstrating imbalance, dizziness, vertigo and nausea for protracted periods of time, you need to consider a vestibular assessment by a qualified professional. If the vestibular nerve is concussed, that involves a completely unique treatment approach to resolve. It's a different approach. It's very specific. You need to consider, well, if somebody's hit their head that hard enough to have such a protracted length of symptoms, well, then you need to consider, is there a whiplash situation in the neck that's producing some of those symptoms? Because the neck alone will produce imbalance and dizziness. So it's sometimes when the symptoms are beyond the standard management tool, so they're not resolving, you need to start looking into those more specialised approaches.
Okay. Wow, it's a bit more complicated than what people think, which is why I think we brought that handbook out.
It is, but a basic self-resolving concussion isn't complicated if you follow the guidelines. And they're different for adults and children. Generally speaking, with children, we want children to be symptom-free for 48 hours before returning them to a learning environment. So return them to school first. So long as they're surviving school without modification, so they're not needing rest breaks, they're not needing additional time to complete work, and they're still symptom-free, then you return them to a graduated exercise load and light aerobic activity first. If they're still symptom-free for 24 hours at that level, you can progress them to the next level, and that'll be sports drills, non-contact. 24 hours symptom-free again, you can progress to weights training and higher physical activity. If any symptoms appear, you take a step back. You just go back down the ladder until you're symptom-free for 24 hours. So with a child, you want to be working them through that graduated step process, but not returning them to contact sport until at least 14 days from that 48-hour symptom-free period. So as a parent, you can follow that. Make sure your kid's getting to bed. Make sure your kid's not playing on the iPhone at 10 o'clock at night. Make sure they've got a structured environment and follow the plan.
Okay, so a sporting organisation now can access this handbook you're talking about. and because it is a subject now that that has grown in well, not popularity, but there's a lot more focus on it now than what there was a few years ago. So that handbook becomes really important now, but not only for sporting organisations, but for mum.
It does.
And dad and whatever.
The handbook doesn't replace a medical practitioner in terms of if the child has a suspected concussion, they must be evaluated by a doctor and actually and actually get put through a sporting concussion assessment tool. So now, not all small clubs are going to have their own doctor, but if you see a child get hit heavily and they display drowsiness, imbalance in coordination, decreased consciousness coordination, they must be taken off the field and not returned to the field unless they've had an assessment.
A clear assessment.
A clear assessment.
Yeah, very clear. We've learned a lot.
Oh, that's good.
We have learned a lot. Well, I really thank you for your time, because it is a subject that's close to many hearts at the moment, and people say, well, hey, you know, what's he doing going on and all that sort of thing. We understand it a little bit more now, and we really appreciate your time. It's a very interesting position. There's only a couple of you guys in town, the Neuro Physiotherapist, which is not easy to say, but easy to do. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for
I hope we've all learned a lot about the concussion, and we'll come back with more on the SA Sports Show very shortly.